These are my Carrington made a basketball player and the rest made a basketball rolling, so can we stick to basketball for a moment? Basketball player, she was attempting to go for the ball, at least she said so. She missed, and she must agree justly she missed, and she flagrantly hit Sophie Cunningham in the head. Now flagrant by definition, if you hit somebody with so much force that it could lead to injury, and if it doesn't appear to be a play on the ball, though his intention was to play the ballpark, impact was all along Sophie Cunningham's head, so as a result the rest made the right call. Now I would be remiss if I didn't mention, have we seen Sophie Cunningham aggress of lethal an individual before and not get thrown out of the game? Sure. How we seen Caitlin Clark aggressively foul an individual by hitting them in the head and not get out of the game? Absolutely, you cannot be ignorant to that truth, but if we are paying attention to what DiJonai Carrington intended to Sophie Cunningham, it was not a race. The base decision and to call that a white privilege-based foul is to completely undermine the term of white privilege and to also completely ignore the rules in basketball. I'd like to briefly address a couple of issues, starting with the flagrant 2 and ejection of DiJonai Carrington against Sophie Cunningham. And subsequent social media posting in which the John called it white privilege and tagged the Indiana Fever in accordance with core values of the league, which include justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We will be immediately launching another investigation into the Indiana Fever and the referees in question. If clotheslining and bloodying the face of another player resulting in an objection is indeed proven to be white privilege, we will take swift and decisive action. Our focus will continue to be protecting solely non-white players from hate, abuse, and demonization. The league has also been made aware of an incident July 28th in which a Seattle Storm fan spit in the face of an Indiana Fever fan. We will also be launching a thorough investigation into that incident, and we can only assume the Fever fan said something racist, and if that is the case, they will be banned for life. We are committed to stopping the hate and keeping this league a safe space now, and in the future we need to have a very serious, yes, and very uncomfortable conversation about what DiJonai Carrington has done since being ejected from the Indiana Fever game for the flagrant foul on Sophie Cunningham, because the sequence of events following that ejection has now produced a situation that is more revealing and more damaging than the original incident itself, and the additional layer of what Stephanie White is communicating about the Indiana Fever locker room makes the complete picture even more concerning. Let us start with what Carrington has done and said since the ejection, because the documented record of her post-game actions requires direct and honest examination. Following her ejection, Carrington made public statements that invoke the concept of white privilege in connection with the incident and its aftermath. She then issued a clarification claiming that her use of that framing was not what observers understood it to be, and that her academic background, specifically her education at schools including Baylor, Stanford, where she studied relevant subject matter, qualifies her to speak with authority on the subject in ways that her critics cannot match. Let us address the clarification directly because it raises more questions than it resolves. If Carrington post-game framing was not invoking white privilege and the way the basketball community understood it, then what was the actual substance of what she was community? Aiding a clarification does not provide the specificity. It argues that she possesses the educational background and lived experience to use such terms with precision, but it does not explain what she was actually saying. A clarification that explains your qualifications to make a statement without explaining the actual content of the statement is not a clarification, it is a deflection wrapped in credential citation. The basketball community watching this unfold is asking a simple and direct question, whereas the evidence that she claims to have, she stated publicly that she would never invoke concepts of this weight without having substantial evidence to support the claim. The basketball community is asking her to produce that evidence. That request has not been satisfied by explaining where she went to school. The observation that matters most here is this: Carrington received a flagrant 2 objection for contact on a player that left that player bleeding from the mouth. The institute and disciplinary process that governs the league assessed the contact as warning objection. The response from Carrington in the aftermath was not an apology to the player she fouled. It was not an acknowledgement that the contact was excessive. It was a framing that positioned herself as the subject of unfair treatment and invoked concepts of race and privilege without providing the evidence she claims to have. When you face consequences for your actions and your responses, to characterize the consequences as discrimination rather than to address the actions that produce the consequences. The basketball community notices that sequence the documented history of Carrington physical play in this league provides context that every honest observer of this situation must acknowledge. She has had multiple documented incidents of physical contact across multiple opponents throughout her career in this league. Those incidents are captured on film. They include contact with players across different teams in different competitive situations. The pattern that emerges from reviewing those documented incidents is relevant to understanding whether the foul on Cunningham was an isolated moment of excessive competitive contact or whether it reflects a consistent approach to physical play that the available footage documents across multiple situations. Now let us turn to what Stephanie White is communicating, because her additional comments about the locker room deserve direct examination against the observable evidence that the basketball community has been accumulating throughout the season. Looks minimizing. Think any one of us on all the time. A whole thing that we learned how to be responsible then reactive. In certain situations, I think it's really easy. And, especially quote for young people or for those who aren't in every night, that everything that happens, it's also dangerous. Yeah, You, I think, just me from a humanistic perspective and lifeless or perspective as well, your job. Of responding, I think, on purpose. Good job of parring into one another. Keep in the main. Of understanding that there are a lot of folks out there. There are a lot of folks out there. What? Just for us in our locker room when you do a really good job of keeping that outside and pulling. I see apply for always forgetting here. A problem for that, and I think outside of even just short Nelson, the job so frank was forced. White has made statements suggesting that the Indiana Fever locker room is functioning as a cohesive and united group. The basketball community watching this franchise closely has been compiling specific observable moments that it believes contradict that characterization, and those moments deserve to be named directly. When my usual Heinz Allen had a direct confrontation with Dana Bonner in a previous situation, observers noted that her minutes in subsequent games decreased when Raven Johnson was present in the vicinity of that situation. Her minutes also decreased in games that followed when Sophie Cunningham made public statements that reflected her competitive character and her willingness to advocate for her position. The observable data on her shot attempts in subsequent games reflected what critics characterize as a reduction compared to her prior usage patterns. These are specific observations about document ID and measurable outcomes following specific events, whether those outcomes reflect deliberate coaching decisions as responses to those events or whether they reflect unrelated factors, is a question that the franchise's organizational leadership would need to address with specific and verifiable explanation. What the basketball community is not doing is accepting the characterization that all is well in the locker room when the observable evidence of playing time and usage patterns reflects these specific changes following these specific events. The moment where Ty Harris appeared visibly unengaged with Caitlin Clark's double performance in a recent game has been circulated as an example of the locker room dynamics that White's positive characterizations do not capture. The moment where Brianna January appeared visibly unenthusiastic during Clark's Player of the Week announcement has been circulated for the same reason. These are captured moments that the basketball community is applying to the question of whether the organizational culture inside this franchise reflects genuine collective investment in the success of its most important player. The new eyeballs that this league has gained through the Clark era are not operating with the same baseline assumptions that long-standing WNBA fans may bring to these situations. The new audience that found the sport through Claw Mark arrived with fresh and often skeptical perspectives. That audience does not have years of relationship with this institution that might incline it toward charitable interpretations of concerning signals. It is evaluating what it sees and drawing conclusions based on what is observable. What is observable is this: when players in this franchise demonstrate visibly unenthusiastic reactions to the historic accomplishments of the teammate who is driving the commercial expansion of the entire enterprise. The new audience notices when a head coach makes statements at a press conference that defend the opposing player who just delivered a flagrant foul on one of her own players. The audience notices when playing time patterns following specific events within the organization raise questions about whether the coaching staff is managing situations in ways that create consequences for players who demonstrate certain behaviors. The new audience notices that new audience is substantial, it is engaged, and it is not buying what it is being sold about the state of this locker room. The Carrington situation, the White press conference defensive of Carrington, and the observable evidence that the basketball community is citing about locker room dynamics all exist in the same conversation, and they are being evaluated together rather than in isolation. When you combine all of those comments into a single coherent picture, the story it tells about the institutional environment surrounding Caitlin Clark at Indiana is not the story of a unified team fully committed to maximizing the historic opportunity in front of it. The basketball community has been patient with this situation throughout an entire season. It has documented incidents, it has cataloged moments, it has compiled observable evidence, and it has been raising concerns that have now escalated to the point where the lieutenant governor of Indiana is publicly calling for a coaching change, and national conversations about the organizational culture of this franchise are happening with increasing volume and intensity. Carrington clarification claims educational and experiential authority without providing the evidence she says she possesses. The basketball community is not accepting credentials as a substitute for evidence. Her academic background is genuinely impressive. That background does not change the documented sequence of events following her action does not produce the evidence she claimed to have, and does not address the specific question the basketball community continues to ask. Stephanie White's characterization of the locker room as unified and positive is being measured against observable evidence that the basketball community has been compiling throughout the season. The specific instances where playing time changed following specific events, the specific moments of visible disengagement from teammates during Clark's achievements, and the specific press conference moment where White defended an opposing player who fouled one of her own roster members to the point of drawing blood. All of that evidence is being applied to the assessment of whether White's characterization and matches observable reality. The franchise has a specific and pressing accountability obligation at this moment. The players on this roster who have demonstrated concerns about the organizational culture through their observable behavior deserve to have those concerns addressed. The players who have demonstrated genuine and can see Assistant support for Clark, specifically Cunningham, deserved to have that support recognized and reciprocated at the organizational level, and the franchise's organizational leadership owes the fans who have driven the commercial expansion of this enterprise through their investment and their engagement and honest accounting of what is actually happening inside. This locker room. Carrington was ejected for a flagrant foul. She then made public statements invoking concepts of race and privilege without providing the evidence she claimed to possess. She then issued a clarification that cited her educational background without addressing the substance of what she was actually claiming. That sequence is documented. And it is on the public record. The basketball community is watching. It has the receipts, and it is not accepting deflection dressed up as clarification. The question of what happens next with both the Carrington disciplinary review and the Stephanie White coaching situation will tell the basketball community and the broader audience that has found this sport through Clark's presence whether the institutions governing this league and this franchise understand the gravity of what is occurring around one of the most commercially and competitively significant players this sport has ever seen. The new audience is paying attention, and they are far less patient with institutional deflection than